Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to the 31st Canadian Military History Colloquium, Day 2. I'm Brittany Dunn. I'm the co-organizer of this year's conference. I'm also the managing editor of Canadian Military History and a PhD candidate here at Wilfrid Laurier University.
And I'm Matt Baker. I am the co-coordinator of the conference and project manager here at the center. Thank you so much for joining us here on day 2. We are thrilled with how well day 1 went and would like to extend our thanks to all of the presenters and the chairs for putting so much time into their presentations and even coming and practicing with us over Zoom. It really did pay off. A few housekeeping notes just before we get going here. Closed captioning is available on every session, and you can toggle that on at the bottom of your screen. Please keep in mind that it is computer generated, and that means that for highly technical terms and for non-English words, it probably will struggle. So please just bear that in mind. You can submit a question for presenters at any time by using the Q&A function, also at the bottom of your screen. And you may have noticed already that before each of the panels, there will be a series of slides. Some of them will explain how those functions work. If you have any questions or issues, we have a frequently asked questions page for attendees on our website, and you can find that by going to canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/conference. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite on Dr. Roger Sardi of Wilfrid Laurier University, who is here to introduce this year's keynote. Take it away, Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt and Brittany. You've been doing an amazing job. We're in for a treat today. I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Fennell at a conference at the Royal Military College in November 2018, when he gave us a taste of his wonderful book, Fighting the People's War, which was just about to be published. It was an electrifying experience for a guy of my generation. I was born just a few years after the Second World War, when the Canadian economy was booming. We thought the great future had arrived, and the war was universally celebrated as the great crusade for democracy. Jonathan, in his paper at RMC, looked at things from another perspective, what the men and the women who actually had to do the fighting thought about our marvelous capitalist democratic society during the war, in the wake of the Great Depression. I actually discovered my notes that I took during Jonathan's talk. And his key point that I wrote down, though he would put it much more elegantly, was that the war was fought by the Depression generation who felt that they had been screwed by the state. He put it much more elegantly, as I said, and he covered the globe. He was able to prove his thesis for New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, and the rest of it. I must say, I was where it was a huge revelation for me, and it showed Jonathan's great use of Canadian sources, was I had noted in all of my decades of work in the Mackenzie King diaries that Mackenzie King, as our wartime leader, was constantly worried about justifying the war effort to the people and assuring the people that the burden was being equitably shared among the population. Jonathan just demonstrated this concern right throughout the Commonwealth. Jonathan is a reader in modern history at King's College London and co-director of the Sir Michael Howard Centre for the History of War. After completing a doctorate in modern history at Oxford, Jonathan worked as a management consultant in the City of London before joining King's College in 2009. People's War is his second blockbuster book, and it has been enormously celebrated. Among other distinctions, it won the Royal United Services Institute Duke of Wellington Medal for Military History, the Templar Medal for the History of the British Army from the Society for Army Historical Research, and a Silver Medal as a Military History Matters Book of the Year, and that prize is decided by a public vote. It is a great honor to have you here with us today, Jonathan.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you for such a kind introduction. Thank you to the Centre for inviting me today, and to Brittany and to Matt and to Mark and to Kevin. it's a huge honor to get the chance to speak to everybody today. It was nice to dial into the papers yesterday and see some familiar faces, to see some of the new talent coming through, and to get a bit of our community back. So I'm thrilled to be here, and to get a chance to talk a bit about fighting the People's War. That will be the centerpiece of this talk today. For those who have read it, those who haven't read it, I guess I'm going to give you an overview of the core arguments, with a kind of leaning towards the Canadian side of the experience. For those who have read it, I'm going to try and build on some of the Canadian sides, and in some small, but I think in important ways that I hope will add value to listeners. So the approach I'm going to take over the next 45 to 50 minutes is it's going to have three strands, and there's going to be kind of three key arguments or themes to what I'm going to talk about. And the first one is, to understand the Canadian Army's war, I think we have to have a transnational approach. We have to engage with the team. Doug Delaney's argument. A shared doctrine, organization to extent weapons. So we think beyond the state, we think beyond the nation, and think about these imperial armies. The second strand is we'll term an integrative approach. So this paper is going to combine the military history of great armies with a wide literature on the political, social, and economic histories of Britain and the Commonwealth. Now, we're all familiar with Sir Michael Howard's great dictum: wars are not tactical exercises writ large, but combats between whole societies, right? Not only can the behavior of armies best be understood in their political and social context, but I argue too that societies can be more fully comprehended by assessing the conduct of citizens in military service to the state. It tells us something about the state. War can bring into the open so much that is normally latent, said Indevar Kamtekar, and concentrate and magnify phenomena for the benefit of the student. Just as we search for the origin of war in the preceding years of peace, said Elizabeth Keir, we should also consider how the origins of the domestic order may be found in the preceding war. The third strand is a democratic approach. So the paper and the book took seriously the agency of ordinary citizens embroiled in the conflict. I was able to do this by making use of certain sources. For a start, censorship summaries, right? Soldiers writing home to their loved ones. These letters are censored and turned into weekly and bi-weekly and sometimes monthly morale reports effectively. I was able to find 925 of these. And 69 of these were focused on the Canadians. And actually, there's an extra 2 that I've looked at for today's paper, which focus on Dieppe. These give a sense of what the soldier's thinking, feeling, what's motivating the soldier, and how the soldier is experiencing the war. Also able to make use of quantitative metrics such as sickness, desertion, battle exhaustion, self-inflicted wound rates. And certainly medical practitioners at the time of the war were convinced that these metrics were as good as a temperature chart when in terms of kind of understanding fluctuations in morale. I look at voting statistics, remarkably statistics for how soldiers as a distinct occupational class, especially in Canada and New Zealand, still exist, and indeed in Australia. So we can get an extent what the war was doing to political persuasions. And then by looking at occupational data, say backgrounds, whether it's language spoken, job worked, we can get a sense of social class. Were these armies representative of the societies from which they came? And the argument that emerges, I think, is challenging. It challenges the dominant narrative, the Churchillian narrative to an extent. And if we think about strategy as a iterative, multi-level decision-making continuum, where decisions at the lowest levels can filter up the levels of war and have impact at the operational strategic level, it makes sense, right? We must integrate ordinary people into the narrative, not just in terms of saying this is what it was like, but we must grant them agency. They could shape their universe. And this mattered both in terms of how the war was fought, but also in terms of how the post-war world was shaped and emerged. So let me start off with kind of 2 of the key themes or arguments: the military defeat of the Axis and the place of the empire in the post-war world. So I'm kind of influenced by David Edgerton and John Darwin in arguing that the empire in the interwar years is strong, it's not weak. The extent of British and Commonwealth military power during these years was a reflection first and foremost of Britain's economic, geopolitical, and demographic strengths. Britain provided the vast majority of the funding for the interwar British and Commonwealth armies and just about all of the equipment. For example, in the fiscal year 37-38, Britain spent about 265 million on defense, while India spent about 35, Canada 7, Australia 6, South Africa 2, and New Zealand a little less. The UK provided 90% of imperial munitions to the end of 1940, a proportion that remained above 60% even after the United States entered the war. So from the onset of the international crisis instigated by Hitler's rise to power, Britain increased its defense expenditure by a factor of 24. Now, by comparison, Germany increased its spending by a multiple of 75, but Germany started from a lower base. The French War Ministry, for example, estimated that Britain, not including the Empire, spent just over 15 billion francs on defense in 1928, compared to the Germans, who spent 4.3, barely 28% of the total. By 1938, French intelligence noted that the only state to exceed British rearmament expenditure was Nazi Germany. And if one added the military spending of the Dominions, the British Empire already had the largest defense budget in the world. Now, we know that a lot of that came late, but we must get away from the technological determinist argument. And Tim Cook has made that very powerfully in his own books, and I'm inclined to certainly agree with it. Recent scholarship has also shown that the Army's intellectual, doctrinal preparation for war was far more advanced, modern, and reflective than the historiography has traditionally suggested. In the interwar years, the General Staff issued no fewer than 4 editions of its main doctrinal manual, the Field Service Regulations, the Tactical Bible for all the British and Commonwealth armies, compared with the 2 editions of German and French doctrine produced during the same period. The British Army had identified the key intellectual and doctrinal aspects to the coming war well before 1939. Okay, so they rejected the attritional-based siege warfare that had characterized engagement on the Western Front, sought to ensure speed, mobility, and surprise in its battlefield behavior by embracing modern technology through the use of tanks, trucks, and air power. Furthermore, according to David French, the Army was wedded to the necessity of all arms cooperating in battle to ensure decisive results. The emphasis on cooperation extended also to the Army's relationship with the Royal Air Force. FSR had, little to say about air and land battle, but that did not mean that the necessity for cooperation with an air component was lost on the War Office. So recent research by Terry Kopp in Canada, John Buckley, Patrick Rose has also shown that command and control in the British Army was far more flexible and decentralized than generally has been acknowledged in the historiography. Let's just look at 1936 FSR Volume 3, Operations Higher Formation. In dealing with his subordinates, a commander will allot them definite tasks, clearly explaining his intentions, and will then allow them liberty of action in arranging the methods by which they will carry out these tasks. Undue centralization and interference with subordinates is harmful, since they are apt either to chafe at excessive control or to become afraid of taking responsibility. What was true for senior commanders applied equally to junior officers. We can look at FSR Volume 2, Ops General if we want. So, commanders were expected to balance available means with the expressed intentions of their senior officers, i.e. they were required to use their initiative and intelligence and act strategically. British doctrine at this time, I would say the British doctrine, British and Commonwealth doctrine, rather than encouraging a system of restrictive control, overwhelmingly embraced directive control, what modern militaries refer to as mission command, much indeed as did the Wehrmacht in the interwar years. And it makes cultural sense, right? The British officer was expected a smart, engaging young man capable of solving problems on his own initiative. So defeat in the early years of the war was, I don't think it was preordained by any means. Much depended on how Britain and the Commonwealth reacted to the crisis as it emerged. And we can start off by engaging with, say, mobilization. So how did these states, these countries, the empire mobilize to face this huge crisis. Well, I've put a big circle around, and I guess for start, just take a second and have a little look at some of those numbers. The column that interests me is, say, the armed forces column, the third one to the right with numbers. What you can see is in those countries where they're relatively cohesive, let's say the United Kingdom and New Zealand, they were able to bring in conscription. They were able to compel citizens to serve. In countries where there was a greater degree of, or less cohesion perhaps, let's say in Australia where you had a large number of Irish Catholics, or Canada where you had French-speaking Canadians, it proved much harder to bring in conscription. So a dual approach emerged where, as everybody who's listening to this will know, conscripts served at home on the whole, and those who volunteered could be sent overseas. In countries like South Africa, where a large proportion of the population were passionately anti-empire, it was just simple, and indeed in India, it was simply impossible to bring in conscription, and so they were all volunteers. And we see straight away there that there's quite a fluctuation in the proportion of the male population, the fighting age, if you will, 15 to 49, that these countries were able to mobilize. I think the Indian figure is particularly noticeable, but indeed the Canadian figure is worth reflecting upon also. So these armies then were not entirely representative of the states from which they emerged. Socio-political factors mattered when it came to mobilization. Just looking at language spoken, so here's an example where the use of personnel records can inform our understanding of the history of armies. So one way, so the South African, the Union Defence Force didn't maintain records for the proportion of Afrikaner versus English-speaking soldiers who fought. They didn't want to open that box. But by looking at names, to an extent, right, we can get a sense of who's culturally Afrikaner, but certainly by looking at religious denominations. Those who were affiliated with the Dutch Reformed Church were culturally Afrikaner, for instance. We can work out fairly closely what the cultural makeup, the ethnic makeup of this army was. And as you can see there, it's unrepresentative. Afrikaners were less keen to serve, perhaps for obvious reasons. Same dynamic emerges in Canada with French Canadians, as those who are here will well know, less keen on serving than English-speaking Canadians. So records relating to the religious denominations of South African formations show that, I find this interesting, that 24% of infantry, 23% of supporting arms, 36% of artillery, 42% of anti-aircraft, and 43% of base units were Afrikaans speaking. So the more committed you are to the state, in a way, the closer you find yourself to the battle, to the fighting. Overall, 57% of Afrikaans speakers were in infantry units as opposed to 71% of English speakers. Socio-political factors mattered when it came to mobilization. And it played out in other ways too. It played out in terms of social class. Just take a second to accustom yourself to the figures. In the case of the British Army, what we can see is that the working classes were needed in factories, let's say in essential industries. And a relatively high level of appeals meant that Britain's wartime army was made up of shopkeepers, bricklayers, bank clerks, confectioners, tailors, painters, traveling salesmen. You get the idea. What you can see there is social class 3, which is skilled workers, made up a higher proportion of the army than did the general population. So the army wasn't fully representative of the population writ large. In New Zealand and Canada, it was not skilled, but semi-skilled and unskilled classes that were particularly represented in the army. In both countries, in the context of the remote nature of the war, a less industrialized economy, the extremely fractured political arena, and the high volume of appeals against military service. So in New Zealand, for example, appeals were lodged by on behalf of 47% of all those conscripted, with 39% of these based on hardship and conscience. Professional and skilled classes were both more willing and more able than unskilled workers to avoid service. The two NZEF, that's the Second New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and Canadian Army were to a greater extent than their British and South African equivalents, working class armies. We can just get a bit of a sense there of the social class makeup of the Canadian Army in this period. Just take a second to accustom yourself to the numbers, have a little look. If we take it that it's mostly English-speaking army, what we can see are classes 1 to 4, if you will, higher professional, white collar, you get the idea, make up about 22% of the army. but nearly 30% of the general population, certainly English speakers. Whereas the lower classes, 5 to 7, make up about 80% of the army, but about 70% of the population, the English-speaking population writ large. How does all this play out on the battlefield? Well, following the debacle in France in 1940, the Bartholomew report tried to identify what had gone wrong, and it identified 4 major lessons. The first was a need for offensive spirit, the need for a, quote, fiercer, aggressive spirit to hit him and hit him hard at every opportunity. It identified the need for more discipline, the means by which the morale of a force can be maintained. It talked about air superiority and the centrality of that, but largely in the context of air superiority impacting on the men's morale. And it talked about better anti-tank defenses. However, even this more technical point was couched again in the terms that showed a desire that all ranks must be taught to adopt aggressive tactics against tanks. The reports coming out of Malaya and Singapore in 41 and 42 were little different in their conclusions. A report on the lessons of the Malaya campaign from December 42 noted that there had been, quote, no fire in any British or Indian troops of any rank in Malaya. By contrast, the Japanese soldier was eager, though fanatical. He was quite ready to be killed. Our men were not. As a result, he was aggressive. We were passive. He was daring, mobile, quick, and mentally alert for somebody who was ready to go to the front and be the first to buy it. We were cautious, static, ineffective. The morale report from May to July 1942 gets to the heart, I think, of some of these problems. It states, quite interestingly, certainty of employment in what they consider satisfactory conditions is the nearest thing to a war aim that most soldiers can be said to have at the moment. Vague assurances from politicians or others and exhortations to join in a crusade do not reassure them on this point. Commanders' reports confirmed that a very large proportion of the rank and file were preoccupied by the question of what, if any, social and economic changes would take place after the war. The vast array of setbacks and problems faced in the early years of the war were blamed on the whole of the existing system, and an increasingly large number of soldiers expressed resolve that the system must be different after the war. Such reflections, according to the writers of the report, were too frequent to be dismissed as the stock complaints of the professional grouser or the amateur politician. The censorship summary for 12 to 18 August 1942, this was the period at the height of what I've argued elsewhere was a morale crisis in 8th Army in the desert, noted that among the reasons making men readier to surrender was the fact that many of the troops still want to know what we are fighting for. So it appears that there's this disconnect between the citizen and the state. In some ways they are disarmed. And by looking at, say, sickness rates, battle exhaustion rates, you get it. Looking at fluctuations in these rates, we get some evidence that there were in fact fluctuations in morale. And I want to in part kind of normalize crisis here, right? I mean, the great military thinkers, Clausewitz and others, they didn't say that morale was important, was central, was the driving factor almost, because it was an uncomplicated static dynamic. Even successful great armies had fluctuations in morale. So normalizing this, recognizing that morale shifts in armies, I think is important. And I mean, at the moment, I'm spending a lot of time getting to grips with German morale and Italian morale during the Second World War. And there's no question whatsoever. I mean, certainly, obviously, the Italians suffer some fairly serious downs when it comes to morale during the war, but the Germans are up and down all the time as well. I mean, it's already been well documented, say, the utter crisis that beset the German army at the gates of Moscow in 41. This crisis was so great, it came all the way back to the Reich, to the home front, and almost infected the home front. So these things happen. These happen in good armies and successful armies. And in a way, I want to normalize that. So for future examples of these types of graphs, what you can see is the y-axis is inverted, right? So high sickness rates suggest low morale, and low sickness rates suggest high morale. And the argument goes there's a crisis in the desert in the summer of 1942, when everything is going awfully wrong around Gazala and Tobruk, etc. This mightn't have mattered so much if training had been better, but the British and Commonwealth armies mobilized late. And so the deficit, or arguably the deficit in morale, or the problems arguably between the citizen and the state, can't be made good by professionalism, by training, training, and training again. And therein lies the problem. Now, does this narrative make sense for the Canadians? Well, of course, they're not overly engaged in the first half of the war. The battalions in Hong Kong and the Dieppe raid. I'm not going to talk about Hong Kong right now. I don't do so very much in the book. Maybe next time around. But I had a quick look at censorship summaries in the last few weeks in preparation for today and see what was going on in Dieppe. And it seems quite clear that morale was extremely high. The morale of the troops who took part in the operation is clearly at a high level. They were proud and pleased at being chosen, and on returning, the survivors of even the most badly hit regiments expressed their desire to go again and say that they are enthusiastically looking forward to another chance. Their main complaint, in fact, was that they were withdrawn and that the operation was not intended to be the opening of the real thing, the second front. Officer-man relations, according to the censorship summaries, were clearly of the highest level. And training was also considered extremely good. Many men remarked on the usefulness of the training they had received and the great value of all they had been taught. Appreciation of assault courses and maneuvers on which live ammunition was used have been frequently seen. The men commented on being unaffected by the noise and general confusion because of their previous training under realistic war conditions. So these dynamics are less of a concern for the Canadians at this stage of the war. And I'll talk a bit more about that in due course. Certainly for the rest of the British and Commonwealth armies, there is a need to turn things around. Things could not be much worse in the summer of 1942. And a lot of this revolves around Monty, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear me say that from his resting place somewhere far away. He rocks up in the desert and he assesses the problem, I think, pretty well. This is a poorly trained army which is having some trouble with morale. And what he decides is effectively to get away from this more dynamic, you talked about FSR, interwar years, this kind of aggressive, mobile, devolved system of command and control. And he reins it all in. He says, we don't have a highly motivated army that's trained, that's well trained. We can't fight like that. So we're going to fight in a different way. And he falls back on effectively firepower, or the colossal cracks approach, as has been called by Stephen Ashley Hart and others. And this is accompanied by a whole range of endeavors brought to play by the War Office in terms of, say, officer selection and training, educational initiatives. Now, okay, Jeff Have's super book points out how the Canadian approach was slightly different, but I don't think anybody would disagree that huge efforts were made in a scientific way to try and improve the human element, to try and better train, better direct, better select, better enthuse. And all this had a positive effect. And as we know, they turned things around in the desert. There's a success at Alamein, and the Germans are gradually pushed out of Africa. The problem with this approach, with the attritional approach, is that in the rugged terrain and mountains of Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, a more aggressive approach was required. The geography made it challenging for artillery to dominate the battlefield, as the craggy mountains prevented forces from concentrating, thus presenting targets. Moreover, there was little open country in which tanks could maneuver. The primary determinant of tactical success in the Mediterranean and elsewhere was the endurance and ability of the soldier. This was the context into which the 1st Canadian Division found itself when it entered battle in the summer of 1943. As the division sailed towards Sicily, the censorship summary showed that morale and fighting spirit was extremely high amongst all ranks. It can be said that with hardly an exception, they, the Canadians, were going into battle joyfully. I mean, it's extraordinary. And in many ways, a similar narrative is to be found in the censorship summaries before D-Day. I mean, just the extraordinary high levels of willingness being exhibited by Canadian mail. And there's almost no other comparison, really. The Canadians seem to have very high morale at certain periods of the conflict, and their use of language is, I think, distinctly different, actually, to the other Commonwealth contributors, and maybe we talk about that later. Battle exhaustion figures for the start of the campaign accounted for just 1% of battle casualty for Canadians and 11% for the British. So it does seem that morale was significantly higher. Initial performance was characterized by intelligent, imaginative, and bold maneuver. The Canadians seemed to fight in a slightly different way because they were well trained, because of the the battle drill focus that the Canadians had taken on and the high morale. But as I argue in the book, Simmons and the division soon came under the influence of the colossal cracks approach. It was hard not to. Here was a confident Eighth Army with a confident commander who'd found what appeared to be a solution to modern war, certainly modern war as it pertained to the British and Commonwealth. So the campaign then descends into a slogging match for the British and Commonwealth armies. And it's little different during the early phases of the Italian campaign. The consequences of this is that by the winter of 43-44, men in the Mediterranean were pretty tired in body and in spirit, and this included the Canadians. Some form of remobilization was needed, something to get the soldiers going again. For the British, this process revolved around the Beveridge Report. I'm sure listeners are familiar enough with the report produced around the end of 1942 in the United Kingdom, and it effectively set out the blueprint for a future welfare state. Soldiers thought it was fantastic. It went through the censorship summaries, wildfire. This is what we want. Give us this and we will get it done. We will get it done, Winston. Give us this. But, you know, in fairness to Churchill, he's in a very difficult position in terms of his position at the head of a coalition government, in terms of his position at the head of a Tory party that was not always positive about Churchill. And he finds it very hard to promise the kind of social change that the soldiers require and the soldiers want. And because he doesn't, because the Beveridge Report is an attempt to kind of get it out of the limelight, this doesn't go down particularly well amongst British soldiers. And there's an opportunity missed, I think. A similar dynamic pertains to the New Zealanders, who are absolutely exhausted by this stage of the war, so much so that the New Zealand government decides to send about 6,000 of them home for a bit of a rest, for a furlough. Well, these men get home, obviously delighted, and what they find is a home front that looks like it's peacetime. And perhaps more importantly, about 30 to 35,000 grade A, fully fit young men working in essential industry, who they say could go in their place back to the front. And the battle cry went out, no man twice before every man once. It's beautiful in its simplicity and its clarity. No man twice before every man once. The government refused to bend, and effectively the soldiers in New Zealand, to all intents and purposes, mutiny, and probably the biggest disciplinary breakdown, if you will, in any of the British and Commonwealth armies in either of the two world wars, to the extent that only a small proportion of the soldiers who are sent home ever return to the Mediterranean. I think it's about 11%. They'd expected a far higher proportion to continue the campaign in the Mediterranean. And of course, news gets out. Letters are traveling to and from the home front to the battlefront, just as emails do today. And it becomes clear that there's a crisis at home. And this then affects those who hope to go on furlough to get a break themselves. And when well-trained soldiers, the 3,000 well-trained soldiers that were expected to return don't return, you get replacements that are less well-trained. And this impacts on morale. And the argument that I propound in the book is that a morale problem emerges for the New Zealanders at Casino. If you can just follow the peaks there all the way to the right, you'll see the box with Casino. Remember, the y-axis is inverted, so high rates of sickness are at the bottom and low rates of sickness are at the top. And so the argument goes that there's a morale problem amongst the New Zealanders, and this influences their ability to clear the slopes of Casino and take the monastery and all that. So the home front and the battlefront are interrelated. Matters of social justice, arguments for an equal distribution of sacrifice matter, not only just in terms of our understanding conceptually of the war, but also in terms of the hard, military history. For the South Africans, a similar dynamic emerges. In early 43, in order to provide what it hopes 2 armored divisions for the conflict in the Mediterranean, South Africa required its soldiers to sign a new oath. So the South Africans had already signed an oath saying that they would serve outside of Africa. For remobilization to take place, they now have to say, put their hands up and say, we'll go again, but this time beyond Africa and into Europe. And the army and the government realized that, okay, we need a majority to say that they'll do this or else we're in trouble. By again looking at the defense personnel records, we see that only about 23% of men opted for the Blue Oath. The majority of these being English speaking, 76%. And reading the censorship summaries, the narrative is very similar to the to the furlough mutiny stuff. It's about equality of sacrifice and fairness. We've already gone. It's someone else's turn now, okay? Only 17% of Afrikaners, as compared to 26% of English speakers, opted to take the oath. As a consequence, South Africa struggled to keep the 6th South African Armoured Division up to strength in the final years of the war. And in fact, throughout 1943, there's no South African Army units in contact with the enemy in the Mediterranean. How did all this play out for the Canadians? Well, by December 1943, the Canadians are starting to get tired. Signs of strain are evident. And I think most of the historiography would agree that it's hard all work over the River Moro and in the street fighting at Ortona. The sick rate in 1st Canadian Division jumps 250% in the first half of December, and battle exhaustion starts to make up a very high proportion of casualties, almost 25% between the end of November and the start of February. And this, put this kind of on a comparative basis, that's pretty much what's going on in the desert in the real crisis of 1942. Self-inflicted wound rate is also quite high, 2.4 per thousand, compared to the British and New Zealand rates of 0.21 and 0.1 respectively. And there's just a little graph with the Canadian sickness rates, and the little the one at the bottom right in the valley, the light blue, that's 1 Canadian Infantry Division. And what we can see is in that period, October, November, December, sickness rates are high. Now I know there's a hangover from Sicily, and if Rob Engen's on there, I'm sure he'll be able to offer some perspectives on this as well. But the argument goes that there's some, they're struggling. The issues that mattered to New Zealand, British and South African soldiers mattered to Canadians too. Of course they did. There were high levels of mistrust over the question of conscription. This was directed at Mackenzie King and the Liberal government. Such a government, Jeff Keshen has said, many soldiers believe would not hesitate to renege on the promises to reward veterans adequately. And a poll in May 1943 that asked nearly 1,000 soldiers whether they believed they would be better off after the war, many foresaw hard times. There was a real concern about the post-war, just as there was for all the other contingents of the British and Commonwealth armies. But whereas other Commonwealth contingents struggled to overcome these challenges, the Canadians, I think, get things right broadly. So again, according to Jeff Keshen, during the last 2 years of the war, the Liberals steadily improved benefits for veterans, and equally important, thoroughly publicized their plans and accomplishments throughout the military. Announcements from Ottawa regarding the gratuity to be paid to Canadian service personnel on demobilization were particularly popular and noted in the censorship summaries. In addition to that, I think perhaps as important, key formations are given a period of rest and retraining. It's recognized that they're tired and they're taken out and they're given a chance to get on their feet again. So the weekly sickness rate for 1 Canadian Corps, which had peaked at over 21 per thousand the week ending 25 December 1943, it dropped to just over 12 per thousand by the start of Diadem, which is the operation to take Rome, and it declined again to 8.8 per thousand by the fall of the city. Sick rate at the start of Operation Olive, which is a big operation towards the end of 1940, was still only 10.1 per thousand. The performance during Diadem and Olive, I think by any standards, and I go into this in the book, it's aggressive, it's flexible, it's ambitious, it's creative, it's everything you could ever want. And in no small part, that's a consequence of morale, and also I think some real creativity on the command level. So what's going on in the East during all this period? Well, not a dissimilar dynamic. In the jungle, there's a recognition that you need to properly devolve command and control and inculcate combat morale, right? It's very hard to control your units when you can hardly see them. And so there is a doctrinal and training revolution and indeed a reform of the army as a social institution in the same way in the Southwest Pacific area as there is in the West. Ideas travel between theaters, whether it's from the desert to Burma, or from the Southwest Pacific area, from the Australians, if you will, to the Indians. And there's a real focus on training and new doctrine that encourages the devolution, the devolved command and control, encourages individual initiative. This plays out in this, and this matters. And certainly Australian operations during this period are aggressive, they're imaginative, and largely successful, as indeed you could argue is the case at Imphal and Kohima in 1944. And maybe I can go into that in more detail later on. Let's get back to where we might find some Canadians. Let's get to D-Day. So Montgomery obviously returns from the Mediterranean to take on command. And his hope, having been frankly quite frustrated by the experience in southern Italy, was to restore mobility to the battlefield. Indeed, to do what effectively those in the East were doing quite successfully. Now, I argue that he doesn't quite get this right, because while undoubtedly there was a requirement for the decentralization of command and the trusting of subordinates, the lesson from the East was not to decentralize training, that in fact training had to be centralized to ensure that everybody had a similar understanding of how war could be fought and were equally prepared for the conflicts and the challenges to come. And what we get is effectively a hybrid approach where we have the colossal cracks idea coming back, if you will, from the Mediterranean, and also the idea of battle drill. And some trust battle drill and others do not. And so you get this disconnect between training and doctrine and the really highly ambitious goals set for D-Day and indeed for Normandy writ large. If you're going to use colossal cracks, you're not going to have highly mobile, aggressive operations. Effectively, colossal cracks is hit them with artillery, advance to contact, hit the ground, call in artillery support, hit them with artillery, advance to contact, hit the ground. It's slow, it's methodical, it's attritional, and when you have more kit than the enemy, then that's no bad thing, but it's not ideally suited to fast-moving operations. And so if we think about the kind of reperiod, or certainly maybe just a clear periodization of the Normandy campaign built around kind of a doctrine and evolutions in fighting technique, what we see is in the early days, really serious efforts to try and use mobile operations. I'm thinking kind of D-Day to Operation Perch, the disaster around Villers-Bocage, a willingness to take risks. But it becomes clear to Montgomery and others that again, the army is not really in a place in terms of training and doctrine to fight this way. So he reins it in for a second time. This period of kind of return to colossal cracks, I think, goes from Operation Epsom all the way to Operation Goodwood. And then frustration kicks in again and a requirement that there's a need for a greater degree of mobility and flexibility. And there's adaptation, which has been well covered in the historiography, really from Operation Blue Coat to the closing of the Falaise Gap. During this time, morale again, I think, fluctuates. So I think that the British Second Army has a bit of a rough time at Goodwood, and I think the Canadians have a bit of a rough time on the march towards Falaise. Take a second to have a bit of a look at the mountains there on your screen. You can see the grey is Second Army, and the red and the blue are various ways of assessing the Canadian sickness rates during this period. And I'm kind of taken by Terry Kopp's To the Last Canadian article here, and that the Canadians are overused. They're absolutely worn to pieces, and as we know, then the heavy bombers land bombs on them as well at Totalize and Tractable. And I think this has impacts on morale, and in some ways helps us understand some of the challenges in closing the Falaise Gap in 1944. And just to kind of hammer that home, perhaps something in addition to what's in the book, there's wonderful statistics in the Canadian censorship summaries. And I've started trying to do some kind of statistical stuff on it. But as in many things, life has taken me in different directions in the last while. And what we see here is, say, just for example, I know Will Pratt, and I think also Robert Engen has looked at these statistics. What we see here is the percentage of Canadian male who are keen for action in Northwest Europe. And it is clear that from the highs of D-Day, there is a drop by Totalize and Tractable. Looking ahead, I find the Scheldt stuff fascinating and indeed veritable. It all jumps back around the operations of the Scheldt, and we'll talk about that in a second. So something clearly unusual happened, I think, in August 1944. In order to try and better understand what happened, I tried another way to analyze the data. So I scaled each variable using the highest value for that variable across all time periods. So look, here's all the variables, right? Contented. So the censorship summaries say what percent, how many letters were contented, and you can then work out proportions by looking at the total number that read, how many letters were keen for action, how many letters thought education was good, how many letters thought education was bad. You see, it's just wonderful. So by putting the highest value for that values for a given variable are all converted to a percentage of the highest value. This kind of gives a sense of the variation. And okay, you might be scratching your head, but if you just see where the sick right arrow is there, it's high, that's the blue line. What you see is all the other factors are collapsing. And to me, that's what a moment of crisis looks like. It's not one thing goes wrong, because usually organizations are flexible enough to overcome. It's when a lot of stuff goes wrong. And I think by this stage in early August, I think the Canadians are tired. And I think some of their stuff is going wrong too. And I think there's a bit of a morale problem. But I'm trying to normalize that, right? I don't think that's in any way, a harsh criticism of the Canadian Army. I think that is just what happens when you're fighting on this scale, on this level, against an enemy that also wants to win. And as I hope to show in future research, the Germans and the Italians, and indeed the Japanese have the same problems at different times in the war. So what happens after Normandy? Well, the doctrinal evolution that Montgomery and Coe and Crerar and Simmons and all are trying to get involved in starts to kind of bear fruit. And mobility is gradually restored to the battlefield. Morale is high, but they run into some of the hardest, most difficult terrain faced by any armies in the Second World War, whether it's the Apennines, the Scheldt, or the Siegfried Line. And so operations are hard and costly. And in some ways, the evolution, the fancy new ways they come up with fighting doesn't quite easily turn into rapid success. But I think especially the Scheldt is an extraordinary success, and not least due to high levels of morale. So conscious now we've got about 8 minutes, so let me round off a few things. So high casualties and high sickness rates lead to one last crisis, manpower shortage, and as Canadian scholars would be aware, kind of the zombie mutiny, the wonderfully termed zombie mutiny. I've just thrown on VD admissions as a tool to identify there are high casualties at this stage of the war, high levels of sickness, and as you can see there, VD rates for Canadians are high. So there's a shortage of human beings, and this requires some conscripts to be sent from Canada. And as we know, there's a disturbance or a mutiny, whichever way you want to put it, and only a small proportion of those asked to go end up going and find their way to the front line. So there's potential for a real crisis, but again, the Canadians, I think, largely get it right. The zombie mutiny is known to the troops, and it is noted in the censorship summaries, and it is a drag on morale. But the appointment of McNaughton as defense minister is seen, incorrectly as it turns out, as the solution to the problem of conscription. The troops believed that he would get them a square deal, and that his appointment would be followed by the dispatch of the home defense forces to the zombies overseas. Improved welfare and leave provisions were important, as was the voting in of the post-war gratuities into law in the War Services Grant Act. These measures were increasingly well publicized amongst the troops, and this is borne out by the censorship summaries. Now, they're also fortunate that it occurred, that this kind of period of this challenge on the home front occurred during a period when Canadian forces were mostly uncommitted. And a period of rest combined with infantry conversion programs also meant that the forces in theatre were mostly back up to strength by early 1945. But the delays, the inability for the British and Commonwealth armies to get the job done quickly in 1944, or before indeed, meant that by January 1945, the Americans are doing much of the heavy lifting in Northwest Europe. And as we know, the Red Army is doing the same on the Eastern Front. And so the opportunity for the British and Commonwealth to be seen to win the war and to bear and to basically gain the garlands of such a victory is missed. And this does have consequences for Britain's place in the post-war world. It means the war goes on for longer than it was ever anticipated, which means Britain is further in debt and unable in many ways to meet its commitments post-1945, be they military or economic. So let me finish with some some talk about the socio-political change and what the war did to soldiers thinking about the post-war world. It is clear from unit censorship that soldiers cared about politics and were desperately engaged with the question of social change. Just to take an example from North Africa in 1943, and this is a British censorship summary, there are intelligent criticisms of the government's attitude to the Beveridge Report, the budget, politics, and the Prime Minister. Much interest is also taken in post-war politics, education, and employment, and considerable speculation is evident with regards to the conditions as they will prevail in the post-war world. These political beliefs impacted on the way soldiers voted in general elections. So my sense is that there's something about the experience of combat that highlights to individuals how interconnected community is. There's no two ways about it. If you're stuck in a slit trench in Northwest Europe, it becomes pretty clear to you that you rely on some bloke in a factory in Sheffield or wherever to produce, and some other bloke to get the kids and a woman and kids and everything. So it's all interconnected. An examination of the soldiers' vote shows that not only did soldiers vote differently to their civilian counterparts, but that they voted differently depending on how close I think to combat they were. The experience of fighting, it is argued, made men more aware of the limits of individualism and the degree to which they were dependent on their fellow citizens for prosperity, security, and well-being. Narratives of fairness and procedural justice emerged from the battlefield. Censorship summaries are good on this. Soldiers envisioned a world where the state should play a role in arbitrating between sectional interests in society. This encouraged service personnel to vote for parties that represented these viewpoints. And if we just look at the New Zealand election for 1943 as a quick way to get a sense of the dynamic I'm trying to point to here, you can see there's Labour, National Labour, National Democratic Labour, and the rest. And if you look at that box at the bottom and surrounded by red, what you can see is that the soldiers' vote is increasingly left-leaning the closer to danger effectively New Zealand soldiers are in 1943. So those at home are 56%, those serving training in the Air Force in Canada about 55%, those fighting in minor operations in the Pacific 60%, those fighting in more serious operations in the Middle East, the 2nd New Zealand Division 62%, and those involved in Bomber Command and skies over Europe 65%. In the case of New Zealand, the soldiers' vote decided the outcome in 6 constituencies in 1943 and ultimately led Labour to victory. Peter Fraser, the New Zealand Prime Minister, famously said it was not only North Africa that the 2nd Division had saved. So military history matters to political history. For the Canadians, a not dissimilar dynamic emerged. If you have a look at the highlighted CCF, Commonwealth Cooperative Federation line down at the bottom there, what we can see is, in terms of the forces vote, those in Canada, 26% for CCF, Newfoundland, 31, 33, those in the UK in Bomber Command, 36, those in Northwest Europe, 39%. So it's a gradual increase. And this plays out, as Grandstein has argued, the fate of the government, or at least the question of a majority, hung in the delayed military result. The Liberals won only a bare majority nationally, and the Prime Minister lost his seat specifically due to the forces vote. The CCF won 32% of the military vote, finished 6% ahead of the Conservatives and only 2% behind the Liberals in this space. The Liberals did manage to avoid catastrophe among the military voters, in part because they had their own progressive agenda. Again, according to Brandstein, the CCF's success with the forces was due to the fact that they were stationed overseas and were arguably shielded from the lavishly financed anti-socialist campaign in Canada, which saw the CCF drop in opinion polls from 29% in September to 19%, September 43 to 19% by June 1945. It is certainly the case that the CCF received its lowest percentage of the service vote in Canada, but this was still 12% higher than the civilian vote. Now, Grandstein does accept that the fear of post-war unemployment and the influence of the Labour Party in Britain may have led Canadian servicemen to reject the old line party's search for a radical approach to the problems of peacetime Canada. But it also appears that a spirit of social cohesion had emerged from the exigencies of combat cohesion. This had profound consequences for the future. In the case of Canadian veterans, they received an average gratuity of $700 with much other valuable support available too, whether it's free education or support in buying a house or starting a farm. And this, again, as Keshen has argued, led to tremendous social mobility. The Veterans Charter, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and associated initiatives set out a template for planned interventions in the economy and the expansion of social welfare in the post-war years. Canada was changed forever. So I think in looking at the British and Commonwealth armies, we can see that the military defeat of the Axis was intimately related to issues of morale and mobilization and the extent to which soldiers felt that they were being provided with a vision for their future. We can see that the fate of the empire in the post-war world was related to the speed with which the armies could get the job done. The longer the war lasted, the more Britain ended up in debt. And Britain needed to be seen with its empire to be at the forefront of the battle when victory was won. And the experience of fighting also spawned, if you will, a spirit of social cohesion. So combat cohesion led, in a way, to social cohesion. And this influenced governments through the ballot box and through other forms. So the military history of the war also ended up impacting on the social and political and economic history of British and Commonwealth after the war, after 1945. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. And I think it still comes back to, the Second World War. Soldiers were keenly aware that they'd been screwed by their governments in the 20s and the 1930s. I wanted to raise a larger point, and that is the work of controversial work of French economist Thomas Piketty, who argues that from the Second World War, we got a long period down to the 1970s of the most equitable sharing of wealth in capitalist countries ever. And very, very timely thought here. And I can say, as one of the older folks here, the optimism that I grew up in the 50s and the 60s was utterly unbelievable. And I don't know, to put it into a larger context, very few people here would remember the excitement and the positiveness of the Canadian centenary celebrations in 1967, as compared to the very, very, very different and quite grim celebrations, it's hard to call them that, of the 150th anniversary of Confederation. I think because the society become much, much less equitable and people were much more concerned with this question of equality.
Piketty says it's absolutely based on the two world wars, isn't it? This shift. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely and completely. We've got 7 or 8 absolutely wonderful questions. I'm in the embarrassing position of having to pick. I'm going to try to pick up some of the bigger thematic ones. First from Jeff Hayes. Great stuff, Jonathan. I think the narrative of each country's war effort is an important factor here. Canadians had not fought in an extended campaign before Dieppe and in Sicily in 1943. Finally, they were coming out from under the well-established narrative established by the Canadian Corps in 1918. That's more a comment than a question, but any response would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a challenge, isn't it, when you try and impose a grand narrative on national histories, or you look transnationally at any issue, you do generalize. What surprised me was just how common these attitudes were across all the Commonwealth armies. That all the soldiers seemed to think in this way, and they all seem to react in some ways to the experience in a similar way. And what will be fascinating, I mean, so my next project is effectively a history of the Second World War, and it'd be really interesting to ask these questions of the Americans, to get much more into, say, the African experience, to look at the Soviets and the Germans and the Italians. I mean, so all the censorship summaries for the Italians are there, and there's a huge number of German ones too. So it'll be interesting. I guess there are multiple grand narratives. Yeah.
And we have here a question from Timothy Balser, who's done an absolutely wonderful book in the UBC series on how Canadian Army public affairs dealt with a lot of the issues during the war. a very deeply researched book, and I must confess Timothy has helped me with some of my own projects. Timothy asks, can the Canadian Army's higher rate of lower skill level recruits be explained partially by enlistment of higher skilled individuals into the RCAF? And Alex Sushin raised a very similar question. He's saying, can the lower skill rates in the Canadian Army be explained by the heavy emphasis put by the Mackenzie King government on industrial production and the air and naval efforts in an effort to avoid a conscription crisis? Sorry, I'm laying a lot on you.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation and point. And I think yes is the very direct and straight response, which is clearly, or certainly there's clearly the best, I think, of the manpower and indeed the woman power ends up in the Royal Navy, its Commonwealth equivalents, and the Royal Air Force and its Commonwealth equivalents. And it's quite, I mean, if you look at the performance of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force, it is impressive. And if you look at the performance of the Royal Navy, etc., that is where British strength lies, British imperial strength lies, and that is where it does best. And I think that is in part because that is also where the most agile, arguably the most intelligent, and perhaps, think about, so if your higher social classes are ending up in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force equivalents, they also have a closer connection with the state, because the state has provided them with a higher socioeconomic status. And so I think there are interlinkages here between how the different services performed. And that's the kind of stuff that I do want to get into more detail in future work. Obviously, fighting people's wars is focused on the armies.
Yeah, I'll have to, perhaps abusing my privilege as chair, but Richard Maine, another one of our, I call him young, but I'm so old now that these are now quite senior scholars. Richard Maine did brilliant work to show how in the Canadian Navy, which endured sheer hell on the North Atlantic run, commanders are predicting a collapse from late 1941, and they are grappling with impending collapse right down to 1943. And Richard Maine showed in a brilliant book how a lot of the officers in the Navy, the volunteer reserve officers, were in fact high-powered lawyers in peacetime. And they took their protests right to the minister's office and got the chief of the naval staff fired. So that's a different approach to handling low morale. But of course,
if you think of the structures of command, say in the Air Force and in the Navy, where arguably, control emanates from the bridge or from the cockpit, in a way that in land warfare, it's very hard for a platoon or battalion command or whatever to control. Especially say in an environment like the jungle, where you can hardly see those individuals who are part of your unit or formation. And so that's an added complexity for the land forces, which is if you have arguably the least motivated cohort of the society in an environment where it's very hard to control, that has consequences for combat performance.
And we have a couple question and comment from Michelle Boire from the Royal Military College, who very much enjoyed your presentation in 2018. So I was sitting beside Michael, and the two of us were very excited about what you had to say. And Michael's comment was, he said to me, "Roger, you are not old." Thank God for that. And his substantive question is, Jonathan, could you comment on soldiers' perceptions of their officers across Commonwealth armies?
So think back to these War Office initiatives. What comes out very clear, say from my research on North Africa, is that there is a sense end of 41, 42, that man management is a real problem, that the officers don't know how to look after their men. And this leads to quite revolutionary reforms, whether it's in terms of officer selection, in terms of officer training. And so it's recognized that in the citizen army, not everybody knows how to lead. And obviously, Jeff would be delighted for me to say, read Crerar's lieutenants. for the Canadian perspective on this. And it's clear that there is a slightly different dynamic for the Canadians. They seem to be less inclined to go towards a scientific approach and more to lean still on the interview and that sense of masculinity that we associate and that sense of class that we associate with officers. I mean, there's the old debates, right, about mateship, the more loose relationship, say, between New Zealanders and Australians, and their officers. I guess to an extent that plays out. But I guess what interests me is the fluctuations. When is it seen as good? When is it seen as bad? When does it impact upon how the soldiers behave? And there does seem to be issues across all the Commonwealth, certainly across those in North Africa, in the run-up to 1942, and they do seem to get a grip. And then it doesn't become such a big problem in post, say, Alamein.
And we have a very big question from Tim Cook. And I should say, Jonathan, I don't know if you can see these. A lot of these questions come with congratulations for a People's War. I was going to say, again, chair's privilege. I was rereading your bit on the agony of the Normandy campaign, especially at Falaise. And what blew me away was your sensitivity to the Canadian work. And this is fairly profound because a lot of Canadian work has been inspired, and I hesitate to speak for one of my great mentors, Terry Kopp, but a lot of the Canadian work has been inspired by fairly dismissive accounts in British histories during the 50s and the 60s. And the way you showed not only a profound knowledge of the literature, but saw where it was coming from, I thought was absolutely breathtaking. So I can just support Tim's comment. And Tim's question is, if you could mobilize Second World War scholars, what are a few transnational topics that you think are right for scholarly exploration?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Canadians come out of fighting the People's War well. I mean, I'm thinking Olive and Burns and his performance there. I'm thinking the Scheldt, which I think is extraordinary. And it's nice. It's lovely having this bit of community again and hearing names and seeing faces that we haven't had the chance to see for the last year. So Tim, I think there's interesting stuff about women and mobilization and the role they're playing in terms of maintaining morale and in terms of filling out roles in the economy. And I know there are comparative works, but I don't think that we've even got close to integrating women into the story. And funny enough, I think I was doing that in fighting the People's War in a way that the morale, the to and fro between home and battle is kind of come out, but I don't think I was as aware of it as I might have been. So I think looking forward is, how do we not just talk about the experience of being on the home front? I mean, anybody who's got kids, right, knows if you're at home with two young children and you're also asked to work in a factory, that's probably much worse than the split second of horror that you get on the battlefield during the war. I mean, most of the time these guys are just bored, maybe a bit hungry, but I mean, it's not as bad, you could argue, as you've got kids, you're being asked to work often, sometimes, especially saying on the British home front, there's a huge number of married women with children who are working in the wartime economy, and that frees up human beings for the front. So I think while we acknowledge it, I don't think we've integrated into the narrative really effectively. And that's one of the things I'm going to try and do. So I think mobilization could still be better told. And stuff, yeah, that would be one place. I'd love to chat about it over a pint.
I'm privileged to have grown up in a very matriarchal family, and they were all holding the line on the home front. And I asked them what their recollections of the Second World War were. And they said it was an excuse for lousy service and lousy quality and everything. They said if by the end of the war, they were absolutely stir crazy over the stock response. Don't you know there's a war on, lady? Of course you can't get this or you can't get that. And it was a really different perspective on the war. Yeah, the ladies in our family, they always said, yes, the great adventures are interesting and fun, but the profound question is, who's going to make lunch? And that is straight from some of the great ladies who supported the home front in Halifax during the Second World War.
If you look at some of the, so I showed you some of those, crazy graphs up and down. And if you look at the stats from the Canadian censorship summaries from Northwest Europe, it's clear that there's kind of strong relationships between the arrival of mail and high morale, that kind of stuff, connection with the home front. So it's not just, the most important thing was the male and the female. It was the most important thing. Young men cared about home, loved ones, family, then just as they do now. I mean, I think there's loads of wonderful work, right? I loved Nick Stargart's The German War. And I think he just the way he was able to build the home front dynamic with the battlefront dynamic was just wonderful. I would encourage everybody to read it. I think it really sets out how it can be done.
And we have, our time is beginning to run out, but here's from Kevin Spooner. Thanks very much for sharing your insights. I wonder if you could comment on whether you noticed differences across the Commonwealth governments and what they were looking for or sensitive to in the censorship reports you were reviewing.
Yeah, I think Mackenzie King gets it in a way that Churchill perhaps doesn't. And I think the Liberals are clearly assessing, looking at the censorship summaries. They're doing polling amongst the troops to get a sense of what they're thinking about, and they're promising a new world. I mean, they are. There's debates about how extensive that new world might be, or how great the state's spending for that new world would be. But I think that's central to what is apart from this blip in Normandy, where I think they're just, to the last Canadian, they are just exhausted. I think the Canadians show real resoluteness throughout. And I think that's in no small part due to the fact that they are promised this better world. And frankly, they're given it, right? I mean, post-45, you compare what a Canadian is given to what a British Tommy is given, and it ain't the same. And so I think while I can emotionally understand where Churchill is, I can see the problems that he is facing politically, but I don't think he gets it in the way. He doesn't promise. It's a revolutionary moment. Revolutionary moments require revolutionary visions, and he doesn't offer that revolutionary vision for the British Tommy. And I think in part that is a drag on British morale, and that means you can't take the kind of risks, you can't fight with the kind of mobility and aggression that is required for a rapid ending of the war. And because you don't have a rapid ending to the war due to the performance of the British and Commonwealth armies, it drags on, and that impacts on Britain's place in the world, on the economy. Yeah.
And we have a fascinating question from Tom Davies, University of Kent. I'll just have to summarize. He said, here the Canadians were sitting on the sidelines, except for Dieppe and Hong Kong, through the middle part of the war and the early crises. Have you discovered anything on how other Commonwealth people regarded the Canadians sitting out the difficulties of the Middle and the Far East?
You know what? I don't think I have. Now I know that there is some real friction going on in the desert. After Tobruk, and nobody's got a nice word to say about the Tommy or about the Safas at all. I can't remember. I mean, the thing that really struck me, say, about the Canadian summaries was really real dislike from the Germans, and a sense of wanting to show how good they were. I mean, there's a real punch to the way the Canadians talk about it, which I don't think comes through. Yeah. So much with the others. But I don't recall seeing any finger pointing at the Canadians.
I guess it's just a personal comment working in the maritime area. It's interesting the low level of hostility that many of the Canadian naval veterans felt for the Germans. And I've had professional naval officers explain this, saying that if you're in the sea environment, the enemy is the sea. you're sort of brothers in the struggles. And I've been party to some very nice correspondence between the U-boat commander who was operating off of Halifax, and he was firing torpedoes into a convoy escorted by Louis Odette. And they got in touch after the war. They'd both gone into law after the war, and fortunately, they were both too infirm to travel, but they had a loving correspondence, having shot at each other very intensely through a very, very bitter action off of Halifax. I think we're running right to the time, and Brittany is about to barge in. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions, which include wonderful commentary. And Jonathan, even more stellar than our MC, as if that was possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonathan. We are looking forward to moving on here. Thank you for coming out. Enjoy the rest of your day over in sunny England. And thank you everyone for showing up. We will see you in 15 minutes time as session 4 begins. Take care.